Hello, and welcome to the second chapter of my inquiry into the nature and causes of metoo. This is that other channel I don't want my boss to know about. My name is David Boos, and I want to remain anonymous. Chapter 2 of the allegations against James David Christie and the concept of innocent until proven guilty. On Friday, the 24th of August 2018, the Boston Globe, famously immortalized in the movie Spotlight for their detective work in uncovering the sexual abuse scandal in the American Catholic Church, struck again with another uncovering story about sexual abuse. This time about the well-known organist, that is, if you know organist at all, James David Christie. I'm putting a link to the article in question in the description so you can read it up for yourself, as I don't want to go through it live right now. The article is quite explicit, which I might touch upon later, but the allegations are pretty similar to many of the accusations heard in other cases surrounding the metoo movement. That being said, there are a couple of details I want to pick up and elaborate on, and will do so when discussing certain questions I find important to raise. The first question we have to ask ourselves in all of these stories is it actually true? Now, this question alone might make emotions run high already, but in our attempt to protect victims, or at least some of them, our society has gone so far that we tend to forget about one of the foundations of our Western legal systems, that people are innocent until proven guilty. Since the allegations against Harvey Weinstein started the whole Me Too movement, a lot of the discussion surrounding those cases has been led publicly, that is, in the media and on social media. Emotions run high, and our already divided society is drifting apart even further, into people who side automatically with any alleged victim that claims having been abused, to those that see it as 90% made-up hysteria by mediocre people that want to bully more talented people out of their jobs so they can take over. I have witnessed similar discussions when I made a short post on my Facebook about this matter some time ago. Two people were having a discussion whether MeToo is basically McCarthyism 2.0, a witch hunt based on trial by public opinion, or whether the victims are just speaking up for themselves after years of having been emotionally scarred, and that any comparison to witch hunts or their modern-day equivalents are inappropriate. As a matter of fact, without trying to take a centrist or neutral position here, I can see both sides having some merit. For one, I definitely find it worrying to see that innocent until proven guilty has almost been replaced by the above-mentioned trial by public opinion, and in which we're drifting more and more into an almost impossible scenario of forcing people to prove they didn't do something, rather than others having to prove they did it. Many of these cases seem so clear-cut in who we see as the offender that we are creating precedents that might come back to haunt us as a society in the future. No matter how outraged or disgusted we are by some of the alleged behavior, we have to make sure we follow proper legal procedures in establishing the question of guilt, and even the worst offenders in our society have a right to defend themselves in a proper court, and that is a cultural achievement we should cherish. Unfortunately, the reality nowadays is that most of these cases get handed to the media first, before they even reach a lawyer, after which most of the time the companies or institutions employing the alleged perpetrators react right away by releasing them in one way or another. Some of the alleged perpetrators release a general apologetic statement, which often seems more like it's written by overpaid spin doctors, such as in the case of Daniele Gatti, who recently apologized to all the women he ever met. Just to be on the safe side, it seems. But in many cases, the alleged perpetrators go either silent or nobody really asks them about their opinion. As I said before, I haven't heard of a single case that's been resolved in front of a court yet, and even if it has happened by now, the media doesn't really seem to follow up on these things nearly as much as they are interested in breaking news of the next scandal. Now, despite all that, one of the reasons I picked this case to make this video is that I did get to know James David Christie personally, and despite what many people who have known him for a much longer time have said about him, I could totally see this sort of behavior coming from him. And it frankly didn't surprise me the least when I heard these news. One of the things that most surprised and even upset me in the article was actually the Boston Symphony Orchestra and Wellesley College saying that they had not had any complaints about James David Christie in the past, and that thus they didn't know anything was going on. Now, while I do believe that there might have been no complaints to them specifically, I find it highly unlikely that this was impossible to spot if you were actually looking closely, which you should. That being said, as I mentioned before, there are people whom I respect and trust to tell the truth that have told me that they knew Jim Christie for 40 years or longer and were caught completely by surprise by those news. Since I have no reason to believe that they are lying to me, I can only conclude that either Jim Christie was exceptionally good at keeping a professional facade under certain conditions, or that maybe, to a degree, we've been conditioned to ignore certain warning signs out of fear of being accused of intolerance towards alternate lifestyles, whether hetero or homosexual. This might seem provocative to some, and I do believe it's not the whole story, considering that also heterosexual men in traditional relations, some of which were married with children like Weinstein himself, are being accused of grave sexual misconduct. But what I would state is that there is a tendency within certain circles of homosexual men, for instance, not all of them mind you, to aggressively inject sexuality into their public persona that I find quite disturbing, that I find hard to believe any heterosexual man would get away with were he to present himself like that openly. And unfortunately, if we don't think that discussing our sexuality regularly in public is appropriate, we very quickly, in this specific scenario, could be labeled as homophobes, even though I would be equally disturbed by heterosexuals discussing their sex lives en plein public. But I have to add that with all the talk about toxic masculinity, I have personally never ended up in a circle of heterosexual men that would talk about women in a way such as I found it to be quite common among certain groups of gay men. That being said, I'm sure these circles also exist in the heterosexual world, but my purely subjective impression is that it might be less common. Also, I found this almost exclusively represented in circles of people in relative positions of power, and that leads me to an important point I want to touch upon later. So with all that being said, do I believe the allegations against James David Christie to be true? Well, from my personal experience with him, I can say that at least those parts that hinted rather obsessive attempts of trying to inject sexuality into teaching situations and as a conversation topic are completely plausible, and that I find it to be rather logical conclusion that if you follow that path long enough, you might end up doing the kind of things he's been accused of. As a matter of fact, knowing the circle in which I got to know him initially, I would go as far as saying that this kind of behavior and these kind of intimate relationships are rather common practice, or at least they would be if people have a powerful enough position to enforce them. We also have to take a long, hard look at the fact that intimate relationships between teachers and students haven't been uncommon for a long time. Most of us know some teachers from the present or past that had intimate relations with their students, or that even left their wives to marry one of their students. Outrage on these matters in many cases didn't go far beyond thinking in the back of our heads that it's a dick move, but nothing like the outrage we hear now with the metoo movement. Despite there being regulations in place in many institutions, it seems like those haven't really been enforced. We can only speculate on why that is the case, which I'll do in a bit. This is it for Chapter 2. Thanks for watching, and see you soon in Chapter 3, where I talk about the need to differentiate and the concept of consent. Stay tuned, as that's a big one.